SANS analyst, instructor, and course author, and Itai Tevet, CEO of Intezer. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Dave.
Awesome. Thanks, Carol. And hey, thanks everybody for joining us. We've definitely got some exciting stuff to talk about today. I'm really pretty fired up to be joined by Itai and to be really talking to you guys about what I see as one of the sort of main areas of security concern today, and really one that's been around for quite some time now, as we've sort of been shifting towards hybrid types of infrastructure and sort of hybrid cloud specifically types of architectures and deployment scenarios. And that's this sort of age-old issue, well, age-old relatively in the world of IT, right? It's a few years old, let's call it. But the issue is really doing this sort of desperate comparison of our previous sort of workload controls and control frameworks that we've relied on internally, whether they're really sort of serving us well or not, right? We've had these different types of control stacks that we've sort of tried to take with us out into the cloud, and frankly, that has been marginally successful at best. I've seen this time and time again with a lot of my students that I've chatted with in my classes. It's also something that I almost routinely run into with consulting clients where I'm working with them on different types of cloud projects. And what you'll find is that, and I think today most of us have sort of started realizing this, right? That you definitely can't always take it with you. There's some different types of tools and technology stacks that, you can take from traditional on-premise, in-house data center types of infrastructure and sort of port those out as long as your third-party providers are sort of going along with the ride. But not all of them. And there's definitely some significant changes and differences, not only in the threat landscape, but I'd say also in the technology landscape that are driving this. So let me go ahead and get us cranked up here. So again, here's our fun and exciting title slide. And let's see if I can move these slides. Yeah, there we go. So this is me, I'm Dave, and I'm gonna be joined by Itai here in just a few moments. And so let me just jump right into it and sort of speak to some of the issues that we're facing. And I think this is maybe a little bit of a Captain Obvious moment, but we do a ton of research at SANS, as I'm sure everybody knows. And there's a huge variety of incredibly smart people across the spectrum of SANS faculty and just people in the SANS and GIAC communities that are participants in much of this research. And our most recent Endpoint Protection and Response survey, which we typically do a lot of our surveys every 2 years. So actually this year we'll probably do for another one. But it's okay because, look, if you look at the sort of statistics that we're seeing here, just sort of living the life I'm living as a consultant, and many of you guys sort of in the trenches out there, I think this is fairly realistic. And honestly, it might be a little bit of an underrepresentation of some of the things that we've been seeing. So you see in this case, we had about 42%, over 40% coming back and saying, hey, we definitely saw endpoints that have been compromised. We had 1 out of 5 respondents that just didn't really know what was going on in the environment, didn't feel that they had that degree of visibility. And we did find that another 20%, so again, another 1 in 5, had started shifting towards a bit more proactive approach of going out and looking for things that, again, potentially were wrong in their environments. And so this was a sort of a pervasive issue that we saw. And in fact, it was kind of cool. The questions that were posed in the survey were smart enough to encompass the entire gamut of endpoint or workload orientation. So that's everything from workstations, traditional laptops, desktops, to servers that you're going to find condensed in the data center, and then even out into different types of cloud-based instances and workloads as well, up to and including containers. And so you've got this, again, big surface area that's out there. But here's the thing: what this really doesn't necessarily tell you the full story around is, what's the difference between how successful or perhaps unsuccessful our traditional protection mechanisms were, comparatively between on-prem and cloud. And then looking at that proactive hunting number and figure, I can certainly speak from some of my experience, having spent time with a lot of cloud engineering teams, SOC teams, threat hunting and IR and forensic teams that are still, if they're admitting it, woefully behind in adapting not only their technology stacks, but also their processes and procedures into cloud, meaning, we've got some significant surface area now in a completely third-party, disparate environment that we definitely need that visibility into, and we certainly need it at significant scale, especially for larger organizations that are making those moves. And so what you'll see is, again, as we sort of shift from just the endpoint to sort of the bigger picture of what's happening moving out into cloud, well, this is definitely something that I've been focused on pretty heavily for a significant length of time now. And again, looking at all of these security, sort of control discussions and security potential, sort of threat areas, I always sort of flip that on its head and say, hey, okay, what changes when you move out into the cloud? And the first thing that I think has to be brought up, and a lot of this that I'm going to be talking about here in the next few slides, is driven from our most recent cloud security survey, which I sort of shepherd on an annual basis or biannual basis. And again, this one was from our last year's survey. And I shouldn't be surprised by this, honestly. I mean, I asked the question, I don't want to say tongue in cheek, but I ask the question every single time I do a cloud survey, sort of knowing what kinds of results are going to come back to me. But I do pose the question of what, hey, guys, what sensitive data are you pushing out there? And the short answer is pretty much everything to varying degrees. We've even got people coming back and saying, yeah, we're pushing, national security data out into the cloud, which, I have questions, when those kinds of answers come up. But all kidding aside, this again isn't a surprise. Everybody's moving into the cloud for a vast variety of reasons. There's different business drivers that sort of push people in that direction. But you can see that, these things go together. So yes, we have security concerns. Yes, we need to be careful about the types of controls and processes that we're either bringing or changing when we move into the cloud. And the need is dire. There's no other way to put it. With more and more sensitive data going to these cloud third-party environments. And by the way, it's not just, the sort of most well-known ones. I mean, there's a million different platform as a service and infrastructure as a service type scenarios. And there's certainly more than just, AWS, Google, and Microsoft, although those are definitely the biggest. There's a lot of places where this could manifest or have some sort of access. And at the same time, we sort of went and said, well, what are your problems in the cloud? So bringing us back to some of the research that we've seen from our forensics curriculum and from incident response curriculum, and certainly looking at things like that endpoint set of statistics, yeah, we've got people attacking the cloud readily right now. So over half of the folks that came back in our most recent cloud survey said, yeah, we're really worried about unauthorized access to our data by outsiders, people that aren't supposed to get to it, of course. And right behind it, and I think this just, again, sort of tells the story, everybody's worried about unauthorized access. Of course they are, right? And those that didn't answer that, I think, well, okay, for whatever reason, maybe they were, tired that day or something. But the number two position here is, I don't feel like I can respond to those incidents. So it's one thing to say, hey, I'm worried about people getting in there. It's a whole different, sort of degree of severity when you also admit that we really don't feel like we can respond to things that are happening within the cloud. We don't have visibility. Again, this is something that came up from the previous survey that we had. So not a huge growth area here, but 48% in the previous survey said they were worried about lack of visibility. Now that's over 50%. And again, unauthorized access to the data from other cloud tenants, not just from outsiders, although that would technically be an outsider if you want to lump it that way. But we also said, hey, what about your neighbors, basically? Do you trust your neighbors? Are you worried about your neighbors? Yeah, everybody's worried about their neighbors, because in the cloud, you could be operating in a shady neighborhood and not even know it. And so, yeah, we definitely see the concern, but maybe the biggest point is the last one, which is, well, did any of it actually happen? Yeah, almost 30%, right? So that's pretty big. I mean, really looking at the spectrum of responses that we got, I always, take it with a grain of salt when I look at the sort of things people are worried about, because it's easy to be worried about things. I mean, security people, you get us together in a room, man, we can talk about stuff we're worried about all day long. But at the end of the day, we really got to look at what happened. And when I see that close to a third of the respondents actually experienced unauthorized access by an outsider, that is an incredibly grim statistic to me. That tells me that the attackers are savvy. They know we're there. They're starting to find, sort of gaps in the armor around our cloud infrastructure and our deployments. And that means we got to, really sort of double down on the approaches we're taking to building a control stack that's effective specifically for the cloud. So, again, it's interesting to see that sort of access, and then naturally the extension of that is, well, was there a breach, right? Was there an actual breach of data? I look at, sort of a compromise different than I look at a breach. And I think we have to be careful in terms of our terminology here. I mean, somebody, accessing a container and basically milking our AWS bill for crypto mining, okay, that sucks, but it's not necessarily a breach of our sensitive data. Somebody that gets access to a database or a data store that includes PII, PHI, any of that kind of information, financial content, that's a much bigger issue for a pretty big, variety of reasons. So we asked that question, and of course, the numbers aren't huge, right? We did see about 10% saying that they actually had a breach. We had another 10% that said they think so, but they can't prove it. Anytime I see somebody say we think so, I'm chalking that into the yes category. So we could probably go out on a limb here and say, yeah, maybe 21% probably had a breach. We have 7% that just don't know. We might tilt them towards yes too, if we're just hedging our bets. But about 70% roughly, just over that, said, yeah, we don't think so. We're pretty confident that it didn't happen. But if anything, this chart, while not necessarily definitive in one way or the other, it sort of almost, it tells the story of ambiguity. I think there's a lot of uncertainty all the way around. People just really not 100% sure about what's going on in their cloud environments. And again, I think that goes back to porting and bringing the controls that we've always had or trying to into the cloud. And frankly, not necessarily seeing that work well for us. So just finishing up the story of an attack scenario or a series of attack scenarios that we were delving into across the spectrum of cloud infrastructure, we asked what was involved in the attacks. And this one definitely didn't come as a surprise, but almost half included account or credential hijacking. And that's still today, I'd say the most prevalent type of cloud attack vector that we see. That doesn't really surprise me, again, because I think it's the same one that we're seeing on premise too, right? I mean, the number one way that attackers are getting in and then keeping themselves there is through the use of stolen or hijacked credentials. And, speaking as someone that's been a pen tester for about 15 years of my career, maybe just over that, I'll take that all day long too, right? So it's great to be able to demonstrate the most elite types of, exploitation scenarios. But if somebody leaves credentials hanging around, or I'm able to compromise them in a relatively easy fashion, this isn't a contest to prove how sophisticated I am. I have a goal as an attacker, whatever that might be, and that's the easiest way to get there. So yeah, that didn't surprise me. I'd say misconfiguration is another big one. And we see this all day long. So people that spin up, very dynamic and somewhat ephemeral instances and workloads, whether containers or traditional workloads that don't have strong configurations, that really haven't been patched appropriately, that have tons of missing configuration hardening steps enabled. We see a ton of those kinds of things going on, or we see cloud services misconfigured. And the entire spectrum of that is pretty big, right? I mean, especially if you go back to look at some of the things we saw as a part of the Capital One breach from last year. And not picking on Capital One, because I actually think they're a very sharp team, but, tiny little things added up. And that was exactly what happened with them. They had little things that weren't 100% right. Savvy attacker figured it out and sort of, pulled those together and concatenated that series of small gaps or issues into a significant breach. But again, it was all little misconfigurations. Privileged users, of course, unauthorized application compromise or compute instances. So in other words, people running stuff that we don't think they should be running. Those are all pretty good cases where, frankly, there's a lot of things that, just people should have been paying better attention to. Shadow IT, you name it. It's all there. All those types of issues are consistently involved in attack scenarios that are going on in the cloud. And I love this one because I said, okay, well, come on, guys. like, so you're getting compromised, we're getting attacked. I mean, nobody's laughing about that at all. But what in the world was going on? Like, what kind of a control stack did we have? And this is the one that just, it's a head scratcher for me, right? So people, and you know, frankly, we didn't get down to really finite details about the you know, specifics of what people are calling anti-malware, right? Like, what kind of things are in that bucket of, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes right now, anti-malware. And look at that. Look at the numbers there. I mean, we had 80% basically saying, over 80%, almost 85% saying, you know, we got this one covered, whether it's managed by us, which is certainly the majority, you know, whether we're doing it as a service offering from a provider or an integrated third party into the provider, or some combination of both. 85% felt they had that one covered, the top result that we came back with. And yet, you know, we saw a lot of workload compromises. We saw a lot of, you know, instance break-ins. And so what that really sort of makes me wonder is, you know, are we talking about like old school, sort of classic signature-based anti-malware that's only looking for, you know, X, Y, and Z that was discovered 7 years ago by the research team? Or are we talking about stuff that's a little more savvy and looking at, you know, behaviors and sort of indicators at a much lower or deeper level that would be, you know, something that a smarter attacker, certainly one today, would probably be illustrating? So good question. Don't know the answer, but I felt that that was pretty important to point out. You know, people felt like they had this one covered pretty well. And given some of the numbers we just saw a minute ago, I sort of don't think that's the case, right? I think we certainly had some things that stood out as maybe being, you know, room for improvement areas. We also saw lots of challenges around IR and forensics, and I think that goes right back to the notion of lacking visibility. People just said, we just don't feel like we can see what's going on in there. You know, there's just either too much data, or it's a bunch of just noisy data that we don't know how to sift through, we don't know how to get, we don't know how to sort of communicate that back to the ranch in a real-time fashion in a traditional method like we would have had on premise. You know, this is something that feels immature. And people definitely told us that loud and clear. They said, yeah, we would, you know, wholeheartedly agree. And in fact, I'll tell you, one of the things I do as a consultant a lot of times with clients is sort of a big picture posture assessment for cloud. And it's not just architecture. It's, you know, it's basically what's the maturity level of various elements of your organization's security as it pertains to moving yourself into the cloud. And I'm sad to say that even incredibly mature, sophisticated, smart teams of people responsible for incident response and potentially forensics are often the last to know, and they're the last ones to get there. And that doesn't mean that, you know, they're not aware of the fact that cloud is happening. Far from it. They're very rarely given the time and sort of the bandwidth really needed to be able to sit down and sort of adapt this stuff appropriately. And so a lot of times there's just issues around, you know, call it operational constraints that sort of tie into that. But again, I think it all goes hand in hand. You know, there's a lot of issues in terms of just adapting what we've done in the past, bringing that up into the cloud. And of course, you know, when we look at sort of cloud scenarios, bringing that right to the forefront, yeah, I mean, workloads don't live as long. So you need something that is basically in place along with any images used for deployment. So servers might spin up and run for minutes, right? You might have a workload that runs for 7 minutes as part of a stack. You might have, you know, various sort of serverless infrastructure or containers and things that have a completely different configuration altogether. Microservices architectures as a good example, but also again, need deeply embedded security the minute they come to life, right? You also find, and again, this is not a knock at all, it's just the way cloud is. I mean, most of the cloud workloads I see these days are Linux, right? Nothing against Windows, but that's just not what people are using. Certainly, it's a rare day to find a lot of the DevOps organizations that you know, out there spinning up a bunch of Windows servers. No, they're spinning up a bunch of Linux workloads. And I mean, we all know that that's not been an area of real focus or strength in endpoint security solutions. I mean, in the past, you know, Linux-based endpoint security has been, you know, few and far between. And all of this sort of compounds the issue, right? Lack of visibility, not really a great monitoring story, lack of artifacts if we want to go in and actually figure out what's going on. And certainly that notion of real-time detection and alerting, you know, has to come into the mix when we're talking about this. So, you know, just to sort of bring it full circle and you know, sort of illustrate the main theme here. I mean, things that we know, we're certainly seeing massive focus on endpoints. And I mean, again, I would include, instances, workloads. That's where most of the attackers are focusing one way or the other. Now, again, there's a story to be told around end users, and we know that story. But that's not really what we're looking at in the cloud. We're looking at tons of sort of highly ephemeral, very dynamic, constantly changing workloads being spun up. There's a lot more sensitive data out there, and we're definitely seeing the attacks not only sort of on the periphery, we're seeing them actually come and be successful. We also know that there's a big gap in the response and forensics world in a ton of organizations. People told us this loud and clear. We're struggling a little bit or a lot just in adapting our tools, adapting our processes. Are we using things that are well suited to these cloud environments? And what that tells me is that we've still got a lot of work to do. We've really got to go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves whether the tools of yesterday are really the ones that need to, sort of accompany us on the journey. Maybe it's time to completely shift gears and look at some, newer, more adapted technologies that are maybe a better fit for these kinds of environments. And with that, I am going to hand this off to Itai. So take it away, sir.
Thank you so much, Dave. It was really a great introduction to our next part. So just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Itai, and I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Intezer. In the past, I was actually also leading an incident response team for government. But today, I'm really excited to talk to you about what is the best practices of protecting our cloud servers. So this is why it's such a great introduction to this part. So first, we're going to talk about some pros and cons of the two main methods of protecting cloud servers, pre-runtime and runtime. Then we'll move over to talk about the recommendations, best practices of what should we prioritize among the two. And lastly, well, I was told that the SANS audience is not only looking for talking about problems, but also about solutions. So I'll make sure to dedicate some time talking about our own solution in Intezer for protecting cloud servers. So let's begin. Well, it was very clear to me, at least from David's last few slides, that there is a need for a security solution for cloud servers that is also cloud native, meaning can deal with this modern type of infrastructure, servers scaling up and down, containers, and so on and so forth, and also a very lightweight solution that doesn't degrade our production environment performance. So the combination of these two needs led the market to, and many vendors in the market, to offer a new type of, or a new approach of solution called pre-runtime. And when I say pre-runtime security scans, I mostly mean checking your code for vulnerabilities or checking your containers for vulnerabilities before you deploy your code into production. So let's dive a bit deeper into that type of solution and talk about some pros and cons. So when talking about pre-runtime scans, making sure that your code is not vulnerable, first of all, the biggest advantage is the fact that it doesn't have and require any agent, right? It doesn't impact whatsoever your performance in production. That's a very big advantage. Secondly, well, it reduces quite an important attack surface, which is known vulnerabilities. I mean, many attackers do exploit known CVEs in order to try to breach organizations. So helping you detect known vulnerabilities and helping you fix that is also a big advantage of these types of solutions. So what's wrong about pre-runtime, right? So, well, I'm sure that all the audience on the line and all the security professionals know that known vulnerabilities are not the only single attack vector, right? There are many ways that an attacker can well, compromise a server, and Dave mentioned some of them: stealing credentials, and well, misconfigurations, many different ways that an attacker can get in. And I'm not really talking only about zero-day, sophisticated, unknown vulnerabilities, but really just simple stuff. So that only covers a very narrow aspect of our threat landscape. Secondly, well, if we only conduct pre-runtime scans, this can give us a false sense of security, right? Because we can be confident that our code is secure, right? But if an actual breach occurs, we will have no idea and no visibility whatsoever. So this is a very big disadvantage as well. But let's talk about the ugly part. What can really give us this allergic reaction? So, I talked to many CISOs and security teams in the past few years, and they report that, well, integrating into the CI/CD process can be quite frustrating, and that's an understatement. Interfering and getting buy-in from the DevOps team, the dev team, interfering with their processes, it's not easy, and obviously it can be a very difficult process. However, what I really believe is the biggest problem of all in pre-runtime security scans is basically the fact that, well, I mentioned about that a bit before, but the fact that we don't have any visibility on what's actually going on in our production systems is a very big disadvantage. Not knowing what processes are running, what code is running, what commands people might run in there in the shell is very, well, keeps us very blind in comparing to other solutions. So let's talk about the other type of solution, which is runtime protection, right? Some pros and cons there. So the good part of it is that, well, in contrary to pre-runtime, it can definitely detect actual breaches, meaning many solutions are implying some kind of detection methods that can detect any kind of suspicious activity, malicious behavior, and so on and so forth. So this is a big advantage as well. Secondly, a lot of these runtime solutions do offer an EDR-like experience and visibility to know what processes are running in your production environment, having search capabilities, and so on and so forth. So visibility is also a big piece of runtime security offering. So what's wrong about runtime security? Well, they've touched quite a lot of points here, but many of these solutions are using an anomaly detection technique in order to detect attacks, and that's usually very noisy. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, dealing with all the false positives and so on and so forth. Secondly, most of them have an agent, and just maybe to take a step back here, runtime security mostly means having an agent in the server and trying to detect any actual breach. So a lot of these solutions are, what they do is basically generate a lot of telemetry, right? A lot of behaviors from the operating systems, and then they try to detect something that is off normal or suspicious. All that process takes a lot of CPU, a lot of network, and obviously we go down to the same problem we started with, which is a very non-friendly solution for cloud systems that require a lot of scale, speed, and so on and so forth. But what really can really give us an allergic reaction of using runtime security? So yet again, in most cases, runtime protection solutions do require a lot of fine-tuning. Creating a baseline of what is a normal behavior in your environment is something that can take a lot of time. Creating policies, rules to fine-tune the detection can really be a long process. And the last point I want to make is that, and yet again, also Dave mentioned about that, some vendors try to migrate their excellent, really great Windows endpoint protection solutions to a modern Linux environment that has containers and so on and so forth. That's a very hard migration to have, and that's usually why it's not so effective. So what should we do, right? What should we prioritize, runtime security or pre-runtime security? So my recommendation of the best practice is really to focus on return of investment. In most cases, well, if in your organization, you know that integrating with a CI/CD process is a 2-year project, I would definitely have a runtime security solution first in my system, so I'll be aware of any breach that actually occurs. And I've heard that from quite a lot of CISOs, unfortunately, that they really report that integrating into the CI/CD process is yet again a very, very long process. So what would make sense is to well, first of all, invest in a runtime security solution. However, if in your organization you know that the dev team is super aligned with security, they have security in mind, and you think that in a few weeks or even a month or so you can get ramped up with just fixing your whole your vulnerabilities in your code, definitely do that first. So it really depends on your organization. However, in my experience, most enterprise organizations tend to have quite a lot of complications in doing a very complicated integration with CI/CD. So that's why I would recommend for enterprise systems to enterprise organizations to apply a runtime security solution first. Now, obviously, I'm biased because at Intezer, we are providing a runtime security solution, but that's not a coincidence. The reason why we decided to do so is because we believe this gives the best value and very quickly. And the second point I want to make about recommendations. So there are some vendors who say that they can provide both, also checking your code for vulnerabilities and also having a runtime security solution. Well, here's what I think about that, and really this is my own recommendation. Having an anti-breach expertise and scanning containers for vulnerabilities are two very different things and require very different expertise. So this is why in most cases you see that the vendors are either very good at one thing and are not good at the other thing. So my recommendation is really focus on the aspect that you mostly want to invest in, whether it be runtime or pre-runtime, and make sure that you have the best product possible for that specific aspect. So these are my recommendations, but I want to also mention what Gartner recommends the market to do. And I think they have a very interesting point. So basically what they say is, do not prioritize anomaly detection in order to protect your cloud workloads. But in the other hand, focus on making sure that every code that is running in your cloud servers is only code that you have intended to run. Meaning, you know that what you want to be running in your cloud servers, and you should just make sure that this is the only thing that is running and nothing that is unrecognized. So I think this is a very smart approach because, well, eventually, and that's just a reminder, I'm sure it's not news for anybody on the line, but every breach, every cyber attack must involve running code, right? No matter what the attack vector is, whether it's a known vulnerability or a misconfiguration, in the end, a cyber attack always involves running code or commands in your servers. So making sure that only trusted code is running in your production systems is really, well, theoretically can cover the entire threat landscape or threat spectrum. So that really leads me to well, our own solution in Intezer. So we recently launched a product that I think is very interesting and takes a lot of the pros and cons of other methods into account. And we provide something very, very simple, a product that has a very specific goal, which is protecting your cloud servers from any unauthorized or malicious code. So basically our product does, yet again, something very, very focused, which is making sure that every single fragment of code running in your cloud servers is only from trusted origins and nothing that is unauthorized, unrecognized, or malicious. So either it's a private cloud, public cloud, containerized or not, we just make sure that all the code running in your systems is something that you trust. So very simple, very hard to implement, but that's my team's problem, not yours, obviously. So this product is really based on a technology we have invented that can identify the origins of software, meaning that we can tell about a certain process or certain software, if it was built by Red Hat, IBM, the Russian government, or the authors of Mirai, right? So this is, in order to really recognize origins of code, this is the technology we use as a foundation to power our product. Now, I won't have too much time to talk about how exactly it works, how we identify origins of software, but it's basically based on identifying code reuse and code similarities in a very large scale. So I want to take a step back for a second. Dave mentioned quite a lot of issues we have seen in the current solution landscape of protecting cloud servers. So we really took that into account and, well, took a different approach. Instead of having an agent that generates a ton of telemetry and then applies a noisy anomaly detection technique, we just monitor all the fragments of code running in your systems, making sure that every one of them is only a code that you recognize and nothing that is unauthorized or malicious. So here's how it works in a very high level. Yet again, I promise to talk about solutions and not only just problems. So it's quite simple. Well, basically we have a sensor that does one single thing, which is monitoring for every new code running in the memory of your servers. So every time that we detect a new software, a new process, even a new injected code running in memory, we then analyze it and detect its origins with our technology. And if we detect something, some piece of code that is unauthorized or malicious, we make sure that you know about that. We alert you about that, and also we provide a way to automatically terminate that bad piece of code from keeping on running. So yet again, a very simple process that covers a lot of disadvantages that we see in many other approaches in runtime protection. But this approach doesn't only just give you like quite a thorough protection, but think about it. The fact that we identify the origins of every piece of code running in your infrastructure also helps us to enable you to have a very deep visibility into what's actually going on in your production environment. So that's a really big thing. Well, because we want to make sure that you're not blind in runtime. So you can really think of our solution as sort of like a cloud native combination between application control, memory protection, and EDR all in one for modern production environments. That's maybe the, well, an analogy that I can make of understanding how or how we can help with your cloud server protection needs. So I would love to just, share a few visuals of the system itself, of our own solution. So you know what I'm talking about. It's usually much better to see than to hear. So just a moment, I'll just pull this up. Cool. Well, I hope you can see my screen. So obviously I really won't make it salesy or something like that. I just really want you to see with your own eyes what I'm talking about. So this is our dashboard of our cloud workload protection solution. So you see several interesting things here. On your left-hand side, you can see a bird's eye view of your cloud infrastructure and its security status. So in this case, we can see a very small environment, just 3 assets, 3 VMs or 3 machines, that 2 of them are running only clean code, only trusted code, and we see that there is 1 workload that is definitely infected. In the right-hand side, you can also see something very interesting. Well, first of all, just the alert window. I'll cover that soon, but nothing groundbreaking here. However, this gadget specifically is very, very interesting. So here you can see the origins of all the code that is running in your entire infrastructure. So in this case, we can see that, well, 99.11% of all the code running in all my servers is from trusted origins, while there is a small percentage of code that we have detected to be malicious. So that gives me really this deep visibility that I talked about before, knowing what's happening in my production systems. And well, here you can also see something very cool. In the past 24 hours, these servers are quite active because they have been running quite a lot of new processes and software during the past day. Now, I want also to show you another example here, which I think you'll also find very interesting. So in this case, well, I wanted to show you that not only we can say if a certain code is trusted or malicious, but also if we see an unknown, an unrecognized code, and that shouldn't happen in our cloud servers, but you will know that, you will have a visibility to know if something that is unrecognized, unknown is now running on my production system. And yet again, that's I think it's very valuable to all the security professionals on the line today. One last thing that two last things that I wanted to show you. Obviously, I won't show you every single feature because I really just wanted you to expose you to our own approach and our idea, and nothing more than that. But here you can see also something very cool. We can actually know, as incident responders or security professionals, we can actually tell what are the processes and what are the software that are running on our system. So that gives us quite a lot of, visibility into knowing what's going on in runtime. And yet again, you can tell whether it's a trusted code or unknown code, you have visibility to knowing that. Now I want to give you one last glimpse of what you can do to protect your cloud servers here. So in this case, I want to show you one example of alert here. So here we can see that in a certain host name, in a certain host, there was running, there was a malicious code running, and it was identified that the origins of the code is actually from Mirai, which is it's a Linux-based threat that can provide remote control to the attacker. So this can actually be used as part of a real breach. So we can see, that this piece of code was running on one of our AWS-based server. We can tell that this has been run through a shell command because it's under bash. I can tell if it's running under a certain container, or what is the pod name in Kubernetes that this piece of code was running. And lastly, I would have also the ability of just terminating that bad piece of code from keeping on running. And yet again, this is an important capability we wanted to provide. Lastly, maybe Dave talked a bit about minors, and this one is interesting because, you know, having visibility to just regular processes is one thing, but many attackers today apply a memory-based or in-memory approach to run their malicious or unauthorized code. And usually people call it fileless malware or code injections and so on and so forth. So one big piece that we wanted to address is really to have the visibility not only about regular processes, but also on code that is just running in your servers and has no specific, well, parents, so to say. So in this case, you can see that this is actually a fileless sample of XMRig miner running on one of the servers. So yet again, I promised only to show you the general idea here and not diving in too deeply, but I hope you got the idea and how maybe a different approach that is focused on, well, the origins of code and immutability can help you to protect cloud servers. So I'll hand things back to Carol to take any kind of question. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for that great presentation. We do have some questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for our presenters, please enter it into the questions window now. Our first one asks, what's the level of accuracy in identifying malicious code? Also, what's the potential for false positives?
This is a very important point. Well, here's the thing. There are two main methods today to detect malicious code, right? Either it's behavior-based, meaning, well, I also include machine learning, AI, anomaly detection, all in that sort of category. And there is signature-based. As you know, every technique has a different, different pros and cons, but our approach is really, well, different in a sense that we just scientifically tell you who has built that piece of code, and was it is it similar to anything that you already know in your environment? So that's a very different approach from what you see in endpoints. And I understand the question about false positives, but consider that in cloud servers, you have a very big predictability of what should run. And that's why our technique of just saying, hey, listen, this code is not similar to anything that you have seen in the past is really, really effective. It's much more strict than what you see in regular endpoints approaches, but that's why our approach, to summarize, is very, very, it's not really prone to false positives, and also it has a very high confidence in detecting any unrecognized or unauthorized code.
All right, thank you. Verifying trusted code from third parties is good. How about in-house custom code? And I think this next one goes along with it. How do you differentiate a company's own code from internal developers and malicious code? Okay.
Well, two excellent questions, really. Talking about unknown, unauthorized code has to take into account not only the Red Hat programs, the Docker programs, and so on and so forth, but also your own dev team's code. So, well, we won't have a lot of time to dive into that, but basically what we do is we create what we call a genetic profile of the code that you have developed also in-house, in order to make sure that we also recognize your own teams and your own organization's code. So it's sort of like a very smart baselining of your own repositories or of your own environment.
All right, thank you. So this might go along with it. Let's see. How do you flag known versus unknown code? We asked that one, correct?
Yeah, I think the issue of predictability of knowing what should run in a cloud server is really the key of understanding the answer to this question. It's much different, the container world than the very ambiguous, unpredictable endpoint world in the past.
All right, thanks. Can product scan S3 bucket where objects are being streamed from outside?
So the solution that I presented today is focusing on protecting cloud servers in runtime. As a company, we do have another um, uh, analysis system that can help you also scan just files in your S3 buckets, but maybe that's for another webinar.
All right, thank you. What makes your solution cloud native?
Yeah, also good question. So basically, a few things. One is we have really invested in having the best performance in the market. And the fact that we don't generate a lot of telemetries in order to detect anomalies helps us to really be super low in CPU consumption. And that's one thing that I can call cloud native. The other thing is really more, quite obvious, which is being container aware, working on modern infrastructure, Linux. We also have a very big Linux expertise in-house. So the combination of the three is what really makes us cloud native.
Thank you. What's next on the roadmap for the product?
Well, quite a lot, but I'll name a few. One is that currently we mainly focus on detection mode and on-demand blocking, right? So we didn't want to mess with your production systems and just block things or prevent things from running. That's not a good thing. However, we do believe that we will build trust with our clients, and that's why we plan to offer blocking mode for our product. This is one thing. The probably the major thing. So yeah, I'll leave it that I'll leave it that way.
All right, thanks. There's quite a few questions in this one. It says, does this only work with IaaS? Is it agent-based VMs? With containers, how does it work as a sidecar, an agent on the container host?
Very good question. So the way that it works in containerized environments is that, well, maybe I'll take a step back. Also in containers, you can run code, and that's why also attackers can run code. So that's why the approach is quite agnostic to the infrastructure itself. However, to answer more in a technical sense, we have a sensor that is installed on the host, meaning on the VM, and that VM can run, even thousands of containers, and you don't need to install the sensor in each and every container. That's unnecessary.
Is there a danger in not addressing the pre-runtime?
Good question. So in a sense, well, let's take the analogy of a house, protecting your house, right? So imagine that vulnerabilities are holes in our door or in our window, right? Well, and let's say runtime protection is the security cameras inside. So in a sense, if you have security cameras and let's say a laser gun shooting from these security cameras, you should be covered from all these threats, whether it's known vulnerabilities or any other attack vectors, right? However, it is a best practice to also fix your vulnerabilities in your code, because then you can just reduce attack surface. So if you're talking about spray and pray attackers that just scan the whole internet for vulnerabilities, you won't be exposed. So that's, just can reduce a lot of noise.
All right, thanks. Can it be implemented in private cloud?
Yes, basically, so our product can work in any environment that has Linux servers and is connected to the internet. So some of our clients have a completely bare metal servers, but are constantly connected online. So that's absolutely possible as well.
All right, thanks. What's the time to detect malicious code?
Yeah, good question. Well, long story short, we're talking about single seconds because we monitor for any new code that is running, and the analysis itself really takes about 2, 3, 5 seconds at most. So that's why it's like near real time, I would say.
All right, thank you. Do the major cloud providers offer built-in services for pre-runtime or runtime protection?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So, well, most cloud providers have a lot of security offerings, and most of them are related to either pre-runtime misconfiguration type of like a posture management and so on and so forth, and they tend to avoid providing a runtime solution because usually they talk about the shared responsibility model, which is saying, hey, you are responsible to what's actually running in your servers. We just rent you servers. So this is why they usually provide solutions that are mostly in the pre-runtime category. I would say except Azure, which do have a basic runtime solution as well. But most of them do provide some kind of runtime protection or runtime scan, pre-runtime scans.
All right, thanks. I may have lost track here, Itai, so I'm not sure if I addressed this. What's the time to detect malicious code?
Yes, we have addressed that already.
All right, thanks. How does your approach differ from signature-based detection or simple app lock whitelisting?
Yeah, so I'll address mostly the app lock or whitelisting piece of it. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the concept of whitelisting. And it has several disadvantages. Naming one is that if you use an in-memory attack technique, like running code injections or exploiting vulnerabilities, you won't be able to detect that because whitelisting only works on actual processes or actual files. So this is one big major difference, the fact that we can have visibility into what's going on in memory is a big advantage. And secondly, a very big difference is whitelisting and signature-based are mostly based on hash-based detection, meaning if you have the slightest change in your software, then it will block it. And that's also a very big problem because updates occur all the time. So with our approach, it's much more flexible because anything that is similar from the same origins is something that is still considered as trusted. So I would say maybe that it's compared to whitelisting, it's more thorough because it also looks in memory, and also it's much more flexible and less requires less maintenance.
All right, thanks. How does your product differentiate from TPM pre-boot security?
Well, in many ways. Since I'm not an expert in that field, I can just say that I can imagine that the pre-boot method is less less relevant to cloud infrastructure, especially if we're talking about public cloud infrastructure where you have less control of the actual bare metal server. But yet again, it's the same disadvantages that talking about whitelisting as well. I hope that makes sense.
All right, thanks. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Dave and Itai, for your great presentation, and to Intezer for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.